Our first presenter today is Mr. Christopher Teal. He is a career member of the Senior Foreign Service and is currently on a faculty assignment at the Inter-American Defense College at Fort McNair. His foreign postings include Mexico, Sri Lanka, and the Dominican Republic, and work at the Foreign Press Center and the European Bureau in Washington, D.C. He's the author of 2 books, Thurgood Marshall, American Revolutionary with Juan Williams, and his 2008 work, Hero of Hispaniola, America's first black diplomat, Ebenezer D. Bassett. He is currently working on a documentary of Bassett's life entitled A Diplomat of Consequence. In his presentation today, Ebenezer Bassett, African-American pioneer for international human rights, Chris focuses on an individual who epitomizes the ways in which an African-American diplomat could be a trailblazer in so many different ways.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Dr. Kren. Thank you also to the Diplomacy Center and to see so many friendly faces, colleagues, people that I've worked with over the years. I'm so glad you could join us as well. And I think it's very fitting we start today's discussion talking a little bit about Ebenezer Bassett. After all, this April, in 2019, we're celebrating the 150th anniversary of the nomination of Ebenezer Bassett as the first African-American diplomat. Now, I sort of rediscovered Ebenezer Bassett about 20 years ago on my first assignment in Santo Domingo. I was a new diplomat and had seen his picture on the wall as I was going in for a courtesy call to the ambassador at the time. And a couple of things struck me about him. First of all, I realized that it was very unusual to see somebody right after the Civil War, an African American, was being sent abroad as a diplomat. And I thought, well, this is interesting. And then the other thing that was kind of interesting to me, but frankly more shocking, was the fact that nobody knew anything about him. There was very little information that had been written about him. Nobody at the embassy knew who he was. People on the island didn't know who he was. And I was quite frankly shocked about it. So that led me, through the years to do a little more research. Later, when I came back to Washington, as Dr. Kren mentioned, I ended up doing some research and writing a book about Bassett because I felt audiences needed to know more about who he was. And then, as was mentioned also, I just finished up work on a documentary, thanks in part to the Cox Foundation for their great support in this work, because I thought this really deserved a story that deserved to reach a wider audience, and so that's now being released this year. And it's entitled A Diplomat of Consequence, because he really was that. He was so much more than just the first African-American diplomat, as important as that is. But what I really found about his story was one of courage, of leadership, of an integrity that I thought all of us needed to know a little more in detail. So let me talk just really briefly a little bit and give a slice as an example about Ebenezer Bassett that I think might be interesting for the audience. In the mid-1800s, when we officially recognized our diplomatic relations with Haiti and the Dominican Republic, our early envoys there were all white men. And so it was maybe not surprising right after the U.S. Civil War that President Grant decided to begin really putting across government, leading African Americans into positions of the government. After all, it was the patronage system. It depended on who you knew. And the president realized we needed to fully integrate our government at the time. And that included integrating the U.S. Department of State in 1869. But where Ebenezer Bassett would be going was not only an important place, given the trade and everything else that was going on with our Caribbean neighbors, it was also a particularly difficult time to be going there. 1869, Haiti was in the midst of a fairly bloody civil war. Now, Bassett knew civil war. He had lived through the U.S. Civil War. In fact, working as an educator and an abolitionist in Philadelphia, he had worked with his friend Frederick Douglass, and they had actually recruited black soldiers for the Union Army. And so had been very active and engaged in the political life of that time during the Civil War, and were very successful as such. In fact, the 170 black soldiers that were recruited to the Civil War really made a difference for the Union cause and had a huge impact. And so not only was he known as an educator, an activist, and an abolitionist, but he was definitely engaged early on among political circles there in the United States. So he'd had experience with Civil War, but it's another thing to go to another country in the midst of its own Civil War. So he arrives in mid-year 1869 and finds that the government's collapsing, that the president is losing control little by little over the Haitian side of the island. And when he arrived, the Secretary of State at the time, Hamilton Fish, wrote him a very explicit set of directions. And he says, "The unhappy strife going on there partakes of the nature of a civil war, although it is not recognized as such by us." So there, Secretary Fish was saying, do not take sides. You're there to represent the United States. Don't get involved in what's going on. And so Bassett had to deal with that situation. Well, the war continues, the government continues to collapse. Finally, by the end of the year, the entire country had gone, with the exception of Port-au-Prince, and the rebels had taken over everywhere else, and were swarming through Port-au-Prince. Now, if any of you have been to Port-au-Prince, I can even imagine then, 150 years ago, given the terrain, given a lot of the difficulties, it was not perhaps an easy place to be living and working in the midst of a war. At that time, more and more non-combatants, civilians, particularly women and children, began to look for refuge in the midst of this fighting. The presidential palace had been blown up. There were cannons shooting, and the cannons were landing near Bassett's residence. And so you have literally thousands of non-combatants rushing around trying to save themselves and their families. And many gradually start to come to Bassett's residential compound, which is about a 15-acre compound, kind of on the outskirts of the city, looking for refuge. And Bassett was stuck in a quandary. Well, as all of us diplomats, we dutifully inform Washington what's going on. Of course, now we're emailing and telephoning right away to let people know what's going on. Well, in the 1860s, you had to write out in longhand your dispatch, put it on a boat. Several days later, it gets to Washington. Maybe somebody reads it. Maybe they write a response. Several days later, you get an answer. And so as Bassett was accounting to the secretary about all that's going on, occasionally the secretary would write back. But in the meantime, Bassett, his wife, his children, had to care for this growing number of refugees that were coming onto his compound. And in fact, in the midst of this crisis, as Bassett had explained what was going on, Secretary Fish wrote back saying, "While you're not required to expel any of those who have sought refuge at the legation, you will give them to understand that your government cannot on that account, assume for any responsibility for them. So good luck." Well, Bassett was really in a dilemma. He could very strictly read what Fish was saying, or he could try to make the best out of this really miserable situation. Eventually, the Haitian president was captured as he was trying to escape to the Dominican side of the border. He was brought back and executed in his palace. And the Haitian rebel leader comes up to Bassett's compound and says, "I want all those people. I want you to give me a list of who you've got, and you're going to turn them over to me." Well, Bassett stood his ground. And as he later reported, and I think we can all agree, sometimes it's better as diplomats to ask for forgiveness than for permission. Bassett stood up to the Haitian rebels and said, "You will pardon me for reminding you that the holding of women and children as hostages is repugnant to a modern civilization, and especially to the government of the United States." And he told the Haitian rebel leader, "If you want to have relationships with the United States, You will not execute any of these people. In fact, you will release them and they will all go free. Well, after a tense standoff and a tense negotiation, the Haitian leader finally agreed. And Bassett personally escorted these individuals into the heart of Port-au-Prince to go back to their homes and to safety. This was not true of a lot of the other non-combatants that were caught in those closing days of the Civil War. Many were just summarily executed as they were presumed to be enemies of the rebellion. So, of course, he responds back to Washington, letting them know what has happened, and of course, everyone in Washington is happy that it's all turned out so well, and they all take credit for it all working out so well. But I think now, 150 years later, when we think about issues that we deal with, armed conflicts, human rights issues, international humanitarian law, human rights issues that we have to deal with, civil war, those issues are just as important and vital today as they were in Bassett's time. And I think we can draw a lot of lessons from Bassett's leadership during that time. And that's part of why I wanted to tell Bassett's story, because I thought he was an important figure. Yes, he was important because he was the first African-American diplomat. That in and of itself is an important milestone. And I would agree about that, and more needed to be told about him. But really, it is that courage, that leadership, that decision-making, that responsibility, and that desire for one individual to stand up and make a difference that I thought was so important for all of us to think about. And so that I think is the lesson we can draw from him today. Thank you.